I'll turn to my second task, which is introducing Bob Rubin. I had a chance to work for Bob when he was Secretary of the Treasury for many years, and the lessons I learned from him are part of my life every day. When I was first at Treasury, I had been there a couple of days. I didn't know anything. I'm not sure I ever knew anything, but I particularly knew nothing my first week. And I was in a meeting, and it was in his fancy Secretary of the Treasury conference room, and I was sitting in the back at the corner, not sitting at the table, for any of you who have seen some of my thoughts on that topic. But to be honest, I'm not sure I belonged at the table then. I felt just lucky to be in the room, and I couldn't believe I was there. My whole experience of the meeting was, wow, someone let me sit here. And at the end of the meeting, he shocked me by turning in front of everyone and saying, Cheryl, what do you think? Jaw on the table. I'm sure I said nothing at all or nothing articulate at all, but I learned something then, which is to ask everyone in the room what they think, something I've tried to do ever since then in my career. Just a few weeks later, there was a really hard project at Treasury that essentially had no upside and no leader. And Bob left the fancy Secretary of the Treasury suite, and he walked down to my tiny little office, and he stood in the doorway. I'll never forget this. And he said to me, could you coordinate this project? And I looked at him and said, I don't think that's going to go very well. I'm new, I'm young, no one wants me to coordinate this project. And he did two things. He looked at me and said, you're right. This is really hard, and you're not that well set up to do it well. And I'm not sure it's going to go well for you or for us. But we don't have anyone else. And so I would really appreciate it if you would do your best. And I went home that night, head spinning, and said to my roommate, my God, the Secretary of the Treasury walked down to my little cubby of an office and asked me to do something that I'm really not well equipped to do. And then he was honest with me. And he told me it was going to be hard. He didn't tell me it would be easy. And I learned something from that too. And I tell people all the time on my teams at Facebook and at Lean In, be straight, be honest. If something's too hard for someone, but you needed them to do it anyway, just tell it to them straight. Somewhere between giving really junior people opportunities, giving them the straight story, showing them that you're willing to metaphorically leave their office and come to them, and listening for every voice. Those are just a few of the things I learned from Bob that made Bob such an unbelievable Secretary of the Treasury and has enabled him to contribute in so many ways across American business and across American politics. So it is absolutely my great privilege and honor to welcome my mentor and my friend, the great Bob Rubin, to the stage.
Thank you, Cheryl. I actually remember that project, and I was stuck a little bit because who the heck was going to do some crazy thing like this? But the way to do it was to try to persuade you that if you did it and if I were nice to you and everything else, you might survive, and you have. We were also absolutely delighted to have you be part of our Hamilton project. I first met Cheryl when I was sitting in my office, and Larry Summers, Deputy Secretary, came in and said, I have somebody I want to hire as my new Chief of Staff, and she's the brightest student I had in my time at Harvard. And for those of you who know Larry, it's not something he says too lightly, calling people bright and things of that sort. So I said, okay, let's see what happens. And I think it'd be fair to say that Cheryl has done reasonably well ever since then in business and really more broadly for our society. So Cheryl, we are absolutely delighted to have you as part of our Hamilton project, and Larry, Cheryl, and I have remained good friends ever since those days at Treasury. This is, as Cheryl suggested, usually a consequential time for water policy. One of the panelists said to me just now, it's terrific the Hamilton Project has brought people together because ordinarily what you do, you have a discussion of water with respect to agriculture or whatever else it may be, and what we've tried to do here is to bring it all together into one program and one discussion. I've had a view for a fair bit of time, although I don't really know much about water, that water could very well raise in the 21st century many of the same issues that were raised by energy in the 20th century, geopolitically, economically, and politically. Furthermore, the policy challenges raised by water are really just beginning to garner the kind of attention that I at least think they imperatively need. The combination of one of the world's truly great universities, Stanford, with its academic and intellectual work on water, and the Hamilton Project, which is a Washington-based organization, which has very much a Washington orientation, brings into one discussion a multiplicity of perspectives and experiences, which I think does add a great deal to the ultimate work product. And we did a project 2 years ago with Stanford, as I think Cheryl mentioned, on energy. And I don't think there's any question that bringing together all the enormous intellectual power of Stanford with our own, I think, very great seriousness of purpose about matters of intellect, academic matters, and our Washington orientation produced a product that neither one of us was likely to have produced alone. And as I hope will become apparent today, I think the same kind of synergy has resulted from today's undertaking. Let me briefly say a few words about each of the co-sponsors before we go into the roadmap of the program. To start with, the Stanford Woods Institute, which is the piece of Stanford, the part of Stanford that is most involved with this project, is, as all of you know, nationally renowned as a hub for environmental research and for environmental breakthroughs. And within that context, fresh water has been very much a prime focal area for the Woods Institute. Woods programs like Water in the West are looking at ways to improve water management, to restore waterways that have been degraded over many, many years, and in the final analysis, to work toward providing adequate fresh water for everyone. And that's true in both the developed nations and in the developing world. Woods and Water in the West are convening dialogues and discussions, very much like the forum today, with the commitment to pursuing those objectives and to improving the nation's water policy regime. And we are very pleased and proud to be working with Stanford in this particular forum. The Hamilton Project is probably not as well known to most of you, so let me say a few words about us. But let me start by saying that partnering with Stanford really has been a great experience. It was true in the energy event, and true in these discussions of water, and it's something that we look forward to doing in the future on other issues. The Hamilton Project began about 8 years ago, and it was an unusual situation. A group of former government officials, academics, policy experts, and business people with a strong interest in policy came together, decided that there was a real need for an organization that was nonpartisan and whose only objective was to contribute, to use a phrase that Cheryl used, the seriousness of purpose about policy deliberation and policy debate, and also to, in that context, in that spirit, to promote policy development. And bringing together that widely experienced group of people, and we did it within the context of the Brookings Institution, which, as you know, is a great intellectual think tank, gave the Hamilton Project a distinctly broad perspective on the issues that it focused on. The Hamilton Project does not endorse policy proposals, but rather what we do is to construct fora, as we have here today, to create serious policy discussions about important economic policy issues, to bring together academic and policy experts with practitioners from around the country. And then we do extensive outreach to bring the work product to the media and to the Washington world that we are part of. When there are policy papers involved, as there are here, they are subject to rigorous peer review, just like they would be in any academic institution. As Cheryl said, we believe in, as objectives of economic policy, in growth, broad-based participation in the benefits of growth, and economic security, and it's our view that those objectives can be mutually reinforcing. We support market-based economics, but we also believe strongly in the vital role of government to perform the many functions requisite for economic success that markets by themselves will not perform. And that takes us to today's program. Before going into the roadmap of that program, and before introducing our distinguished keynote speaker who is with us, and we are grateful, Governor Brown, that you joined us, let me make 3 substantive comments on the topic of water. Firstly, as I said a moment ago, water receives very little national policy focus, and the result is woefully inadequate policy in an area that, as Cheryl suggested, has become increasingly critical to our nation's economy. You have tension now, serious tension, between different geographic areas, states, localities over water, and you have serious tension between different uses of water, agriculture and technology, for example. Buzz Thompson, who is a professor at Stanford, was kind enough to spend about half an hour on the phone with me the other day, and one of the things that struck me was just how massively complex these water issues are, especially when you delve into second, third, fourth order effects on other parts of our economy. Secondly, the United States does have large supplies of fresh water. And by the way, the situation is very similar in China. They have large supplies of fresh water. But the problem, as you well know, is a lot of development has taken place in areas that do not have supplies of fresh water. The question is, how does one bridge that gap? And thirdly, water pricing is massively inefficient in this country. And that severely distorts the allocation of water supplies, incentives for technological advancement, water conservation, and dealing with the problem of water waste. Having said all that, we are deeply, deeply honored to begin our program with a presentation entitled The Landscape of Water in the West by our keynote speaker, distinguished governor of the state of California, Jerry Brown. Throughout today's discussion, as I will continue going through the roadmap in a few moments of our program, I will mention the participants, but I won't go into their resumes. They're extremely distinguished, and they are in your materials. Having said that, I do want to make a few personal comments about the governor. Jerry Brown and I were classmates at Yale Law School quite a long time ago, and we have our reunion coming up, which both of us will be going to. I don't know about Jerry, but I've been visited by the development people already to suggest how wonderfully I could celebrate that event. Maybe a little less of a problem for Jerry, I don't know. And even at that time, that long ago time, Jerry was a very and unusually creative thinker about the social issues that faced our country. Water is obviously an enormously important issue for California, and Jerry has been deeply involved with it and with great effect. As you know, he, for the first time in California's history, has now put in place a regulatory regime for aquifers for groundwater, and he has Proposition 1 pending in the next election, which I rather suspect he will comment on. I also think that what is the extraordinarily impressive accomplishment with respect to regulating groundwater is a good example, or exemplifies his broader success in making this political system work. And I think that's a lesson for the rest of the country at a time when our Congress is dysfunctional and so many governments around the country are dysfunctional, and that dysfunctionality is undermining the future of our country. So I think Jerry, as a leader, really has a great deal to say to the rest of the country. For all these reasons, we are deeply honored to be joined by the governor and also by his wife, Ann Gus Brown, who was described by the New York Times as his, quote, top gubernatorial aide.